Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Week Ahead. My name is Jeremy Kitchen. I'm the Executive Director here at Texans for Fiscal Responsibility. We are, of course, joined by our fearless leader, Tim Hardin, President and CEO of TFR. Good morning, Tim.
Good morning. Good to be here.
And this week, we are joined by special guest Bill Peacock. He's the host of the Liberty Cafe podcast and curator of 𝗧𝗛𝗪𝗧𝗏𝒏𝒏net. Good morning, Bill. How are you?
Good morning. It's great to be here, guys. Thank you.
We appreciate you joining us this morning. So today marks day 105 of the 140-day legislative session. As Tim and I have talked about kind of on several occasions now, really over the last week, 2 weeks or so, we are coming up on some impending deadlines. And so I don't want to spend too much time on this since we've covered it quite a few times, but I think it's worth reminding folks that since today is day 105, we're just 2 weeks out, if you will, from the kind of first impending deadline for folks that are watching that are watching legislation move through the process. So day 119 or Monday, May 8th, is the last day that House committees can pass out House bills or House joint resolutions in order for them to be considered in time. And then day 122, which is, I believe, Wednesday or Thursday, it's May 11th, is the last day for the House to actually consider House bills and House joint resolutions on a calendar for second reading. So I want to make sure that is on folks' radar. But of course, as we know, right, that is that those are things that will start to kill bills as they stack up on the calendar. So while we have that in the back of our mind, let's pivot real quick. We cannot afford to not talk about the budget. So the proposed budget document, of course, is House Bill 1. As of right now, I believe it was last week, both the House and Senate appointed conferees to a conference committee comprised of 5 members of the Texas House of Representatives and 5 members of the Texas Senate. Before we get into kind of the nitty-gritty, wanted to maybe get y'all's thoughts on where we're at in the process. We'll start with you, Tim, on maybe some high-level kind of where we're at on the budget.
Yeah, sure. So it has been passed out of the Senate. So it is in a different version. And so now we are, I believe they have already appointed conferees, correct, Jeremy? Or am I incorrect in that?
That's correct. They've done both in the House and Senate. Yep.
That's right. And so what happens here is they take 5 members of the House Appropriations Committee, essentially, and 5 of the Senate Finance Committee, and they are going to go meet and they're going to reconcile this budget, which means they are going to make it into a uniform version that both of the conferees agree on. And then once they do that, this will then go to both respective chambers, and they will either vote to concur or not concur with the committee report. And so my assumption is almost always they will concur, but that is where we're at in the process right now.
Bill, did you have any initial thoughts on kind of the budget document as it looks like now?
Well, just talking about the conferees, I mean, traditionally what you've had in the Texas legislature is that one house passes a higher bill and the other house takes a more conservative approach and passes a lower cost bill. And then they usually come and meet somewhere in the middle. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like there's anybody who's really pushing the conservative approach here. So, the Senate bill is for about $4 billion higher than the House bill. But it wouldn't surprise me if they come back with a bill that's higher than both the House and the Senate's bill.
Now, without getting too far into the weeds as far as numbers goes, and we'll get to some research that you provided for our organization, Bill, here in a second. But, there is property tax relief that's included in both the House and Senate version of the bill. It's likely that will be part of the reconciliation that takes place here going as we kind of enter the last few weeks of the legislative session. But there are other priorities seemingly that both the House and Senate kind of maybe not differ. That's not the right word, but they have different approaches to how we get there. Bill, do you want to maybe speak to your paper specifically? Obviously, you wrote about the budget surplus and kind of introduce that because we can't have that conversation in a vacuum.
Right. Well, yeah. So one of the things we've been talking about, and then a lot of people have been talking about, well, how are they going to spend the Texas surplus? the big surplus. Now there's the $32.7 billion surplus that everybody knows about, but that's the surplus, extra money left over from the current budget, right? But there's also a surplus if you look forward, because they have to project spending out over 2 years. And there's extra money going out 2 years. So what we did in this paper was kind of look at what the total surplus is. And we came up with about $78 billion, that the legislature has $78 billion more in state funds to spend this year, this legislative session, than they did back in 2021. And so that's the beginning point for how we are looking at things.
Now, of course, a big narrative kind of going into this legislative session has been the property tax relief, as we talked about earlier. And what I hear you saying, Bill, of course, is that, there's the projected surplus as provided by the comptroller. There's the additional surplus, which is the money available above what was appropriated last biennium or last cycle. Where are we at with kind of what the legislature wants to provide as property tax relief, and then what's available?
Sure. Well, the Senate and the House have slightly different versions. In the Senate, they have come out with $9.8 billion for new property tax relief through they're doing it in various ways, but it's $9.8 billion. The Texas House's version is closer to $12 billion, a little bit less than that, I think. So they're going to have to reconcile the differences there. But just to put those in perspective, if we look at the numbers, so out of that $78 billion, and we'll just look at the Senate version, but look, out of the $78 billion of surplus funds this session, the Senate has put aside $9.8 billion, the House slightly more. But new state spending on other programs in the Senate version of the bill is $52.7 billion. So, almost more than 5 times as much is going to new state spending than to property tax relief. And just look at a couple of the categories. It's like $13.9 billion is payments to energy companies. $12.9 billion are for Medicaid and healthcare. Both of those categories are significantly higher than what we might expect for property tax relief. And then there's a lot of other spending categories in the billions of dollars that are being spent on these new programs rather than being given back to us, the people who created the surplus in the first place with our tax dollars.
Tim, go to you here next. Obviously, that's kind of been a narrative that we've talked about several times, right? As you have lawmakers who consistently, at least publicly on social media and everything else, right? They want to remind taxpayers that they understand this surplus, represents an overcollection of their money and they're going to give it back to us. But what I hear Bill saying and what the numbers seem to say is that they're going on a spending spree. What are your thoughts?
Is anyone surprised? That's the first thought. We've been advocating specifically for the elimination of school M&O, and what's a shame is, typically what we see the legislature do is what I call the minimum effective dose, right? The minimum that they have to give taxpayers in order to get themselves reelected, right? And it seems like this go round, it looks like they're thinking the minimum effective dose is going to be somewhere between $10 billion and $12 billion. That's likely what we're going to end up with. But unfortunately, this battle is not going to be over, even if that's they decide that they want to do, because one, this simply is just not going to provide enough property tax relief. And everywhere we go and everywhere we speak, people understand, just like Abbott understands, because he said this multiple times, that as long as you pay property taxes, you are paying rent to the government. You do not own your property. And so this does not solve that problem. I think best case scenario for most folks, you get a few $100s off your property tax bill. And I think by the time people realize this, I think legislators are hoping that they've already won their primaries and they move on. But I imagine if this is the solution they give, which is likely what's going to happen, we're going to be right back here next legislative session doing the exact same thing we've done every single session for the last 2 decades, which is demanding more property tax relief because enough.
Before we pivot, Bill, did you have anything else you wanted to add regarding the budget surplus, maybe something that's important, kind of an important takeaway for taxpayers?
Well, getting back to Tim's minimum dose, because I think he's absolutely right. One of the key features in this budget is that they're hiding a lot of the spending increase. And I'll just give you, I won't get down in the weeds, but just let me give you 2 examples. So, in the supplemental bill, which is Senate Bill 30, which that means they're spending more money this budget cycle rather than the future. They appropriated, if you look at all the documents, it looks like they appropriated about $5 billion more in new funding out of state funds. But that's not true, because what they did in Senate Bill 30 was they unappropriated $8 billion they had appropriated last time and then spent that on other things. So the real increase is $13 billion, but it only shows up as $5 billion. Well, how did they get away with that? Well, property taxes, school property taxes specifically, went up so much in the last year in 2022. They went up so much that generated $8 billion extra dollars for spending on schools. And so what the legislature did was they just took our $8 billion extra dollars of property taxes from last year, and instead of giving it back to us, they actually replaced state funds with our property taxes, and then going out and spending the state funds. So it's a game, but they're not just not giving us property tax relief; they're making it worse through their own actions. And then one other quick thing is that there's this energy insurance program that the Texas Senate is really high on. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, and I guess in this they're saying that it's going to help relieve all the problems we have with reliability. A lot of us are doubtful about that, but that's going to cost $10 billion. But they didn't appropriate that $10 billion in this budget. They just transferred it over, right? So it takes $10 billion out of the budget, but they just transferred it over and not appropriating it because they were within $4 billion of the constitutional spending limit cap, and they couldn't appropriate the money. So they're just going to set it off to the side, take it out of our pockets, but put it off on the side so they can appropriate it maybe when they come back next year. So, and that's not showing up in all the budget figures as well. So there's a lot of ways they're trying to hide it, and I think they're trying to hide it because they know we won't like it.
Well, speaking of shifting the burden, this is a good segue to our next topic. We woke up this morning to see that the corporate welfare revival effort that's kind of been prioritized in the Texas House of Representatives, this has taken the form of House Bill 5. It is now up to 76 authors. Right. So in a vacuum of 150 House members, assuming that they are all present, 76 is all you need to pass a bill. And it appears that the corporate welfare revival effort, House Bill 5, now has the necessary votes theoretically to get there. Now, last I checked, it was left pending in I believe the House Ways and Means Committee, but it's very likely with this amount of authors, it'll be voted out, I assume, this week. We'll see it on a calendar here sometime soon. And we're talking about shifting the burden to taxpayers. This is a perfect example of that. Tim, I know you watched this committee hearing. What are your initial thoughts on House Bill 5 as it currently looks?
Well, I can tell you that the witness testimony, when you look at the sheer number who came, people were opposed to it. Nobody wants this thing. As we said many, many times, both reject corporate welfare, specifically 313s in the Republican Party platform. And so what we have here, and I tweeted out one of your tweets or retweeted you, that this is the list of the Austin Uniparty right here, which I would argue there's actually a few more members as well. But these are the ones who are displaying themselves, meaning they don't care what their parties say. They don't care what the Republican Party says. They don't care what the Democrat Party says. This is to help their corporate interests. The 313 that died last go around was the largest corporate welfare program in Texas, costing, I think, a total of $11 billion. And here we are coming back with another corporate welfare program, but wait, there's more. There's less accountability. There's no sunset provision. And right now, I believe the current form does not have renewables. We'll see if they throw those back in. So we're actually back with a far worse bill with less accountability. And so to me, it's like I don't really know what's going to happen in the Senate. Here's as though if we have this thing's going to pass the House. Because they have the numbers in the sure co-authors. And so we will see what the Senate does. But I can tell you, if the Senate decides to pass this thing, it is a sad day in Texas politics when both chambers prioritize corporate interests and corporate welfare over the voters, right, and taxpayers who are drowning in property tax relief. And so I'm going to stay cautiously optimistic and hope that the Senate, bats this thing down. But I'm going to be very disappointed if this thing makes it all the way to the governor's desk at the expense of us, because only one person pays for this, right? There is no such thing as government money or public money. It's only taxpayer money. And so the money that is paying off these corporations and giving them tax abatements comes directly from you and I and everyone else in Texas who is dealing with inflation, who's not able to vote themselves raises like all of these bureaucrats that deal with this. So let's be cautiously optimistic and hope the Senate bats us down. But I fully expect with 76 co-authors, this thing's going to be voted out of committee, likely this week, and we will see it on the House floor next week for sure. There should be, hopefully. So I think where we're at.
Bill, I'm going to come to you next, but obviously, right, like what we're talking about here is that you have on one side of this, right, a legislative session in which they're purportedly providing property tax relief. And then you have the potential on the other side here to where they're trying to shift the burden, right, by giving corporate welfare like this to corporations. They will be shifting the property tax burden back on the backs of property taxpayers at the same time. What are your thoughts?
Well, there's two big things going on here, I think. One interesting thing is that more Republicans are in favor of this than Democrats, right? And you would kind of expect the usual. I mean, the Democrats are not enemies to corporate welfare. But in this case, one of the problems with this program is it takes money from public education, and they don't like that. And so I think that's one reason you see the Democrats on this. The sad thing is that Republicans have just gone all out on corporate welfare in this, and as opposed to caring for their constituents. Because here's that comparison as well. At a time, as Tim pointed out, that we are looking for property tax relief, they're minimizing that over on the property tax relief we're going to get, but they're maximizing it for the big businesses. And I think what they're trying to do here is big businesses don't like to pay taxes more than anybody else does. But if they can minimize them enough that they can pass a lot of those costs on to consumers, then they go along with those kind of things. And I think that's what the legislature is trying to do here is buy off big business, give them enough of a property tax break that they won't be complaining about high property taxes. And so homeowners won't be able to partner up with big business and really accomplish significant property tax relief over time.
Well, I think it's worth mentioning, that if you take a look at, there were two major votes in the House when it came to the Chapter 313 tax abatement program last session, right? There was one bill that was to extend it, I believe, another 10 years. That ultimately failed, right? Had bipartisan opposition. There was another bill to extend it, I believe it was 2 years, House Bill 4242. That did ultimately pass the House and died in the Senate, which is why we saw the Chapter 313 tax abatement program ultimately end in December 31st of last year. But what's worth mentioning is that 6 of the Republicans that were opposed to that extension in the House last session are now signed on as co-authors of this corporate welfare revival program going into this session. So it just makes you wonder if it was the green energy, right, carve out that got them on board, if it's leadership putting pressure on folks, if there's wheeling and dealing happening in the background. We don't know, right? It's day 105 of day 140, as I said. Are there any last thoughts on that subject before we pivot to the next one?
Well, and you make a really good point there, Jeremy. But I think we do know. I think that when it comes to what's going on in Austin, Texas right now, it's really unfortunate that the needs and the desires and the wishes of voters come last. And so members of the legislature are willing to sell out the voters to get their special little perks and pet projects here up in Austin. And so they get a bill passed and we get no property tax relief. I think that's ultimately what we're looking at here.
Tim, did you have anything else before I move on? Okay. It is worth reminding folks that, of course, as we enter the last few weeks of the legislative session here, to keep in tune with what we've got going on, we'll be providing vote notices for our Fiscal Responsibility Index here, going into the last few weeks. And man, those bill lists are getting longer and longer. So if you aren't already subscribed, make sure to subscribe to our vote notices. You can do that at TexasTaxpayers.com/subscribe. That way you get an email with kind of a highlight of bills that are going to affect your wallets. It's also worth mentioning that today was the first day in which early voting started for the May uniform election date. There are a ton of bond elections happening all around the state of Texas. So make sure that if you go vote, you know what you're voting for. I think we can echo State Representative Brian Harrison, who I believe it was last week in committee, who pretty much came to the conclusion, rightfully so, that look, a bond means a tax increase, right? So keep that in mind. Any last thoughts, gentlemen, from y'all on anything we've talked about today?
No, but appreciate you guys having me on.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank everyone for being on with us this week. Of course, we will be back next week on Monday with another episode of The Week Ahead. Make sure to join Tim and I for our weekly video audio podcast, Taxpayer Talks, on Thursday this week as well. Stay tuned. Make sure to subscribe, TexasTaxpayers.com/subscribe, and check out Bill's research paper, now live on TexasTaxpayers.com. Hey, you made it to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. We really appreciate it. Make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon so that way you're notified next time we post a video and update to the channel. Thanks again.